Hello, and welcome to the British Cartographic Society's Teatime Talk series. My name is Christopher Budis. I am the coordinator of the Teatime Talk series and I will be the chair for today's talk. This series aims to offer a broad and wide range of short talks on topics that will be of interest to the community. Today we have the pleasure of a talk from Professor Keith Lilley. Keith is Professor of Historical Geography at Queen's University Belfast and the current chair of the Historic Towns Trust. His expertise lies in exploring connections between landscape and mapping using cross-disciplinary approaches, drawing from geography, history, architecture and archaeology. He is the author of City and Cosmos, The Medieval World in Urban Form, and edited a landmark book on mapping medieval geographies. For over 20 years, he has led research projects employing digital technologies to analyse and interpret historic maps, including the Gough map of Great Britain and historical landscapes, including medieval and modern urban landscapes. One of these projects focused on the new towns of King Edward I and their planning and design. He has long held an interest in urban morphology, histories, archaeologies of urban planning and planners, spanning urbanism of the medieval and modern age. His latest funded research projects are on the Renaissance polymath and cartographer Humphrey Lloyd, on the materialities and archaeologies of surveying in Britain, Ireland and India, and on the maps and landscapes of World War I. The Historic Towns Trust is a registered charity that aims to promote the use of maps and atlases to raise greater awareness of Britain's urban heritage and historic townscapes. His talk today is Mapping the Town, the British Historic Towns Atlases, Past, Present and Future. He will talk on two different approaches that have been adopted to mapping the town and uses as its focus the British Historic Towns Atlas series. These series combine both historic and historical urban mapping, providing insights on urban topography and history for towns and cities across Great Britain. He will have a look back at the early British atlases, as well as recent developments in the British series and its future prospects, combining analogue and digital cartography. I will now pass you over to Keith.
So thanks ever so much, Christopher, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you everybody for joining us on what is a really rainy and windy afternoon here in Northern Ireland, actually, from where I'm speaking to you right now. So yes, I'm going to have some slides, and it's a very visual talk. I'm hoping it'll be of some interest. Okay, so yes, thanks ever so much, Christopher. This is the title of what I want to go through today. My thinking really is to talk for around 20 to 25 minutes, if that sounds okay. I'm very interested to hear any questions about what we're doing with the Historic Towns Trust and the British Historic Towns Atlases. I should say, really, I'm speaking to you really wearing two hats. I have two particular hats. One is, as Chris mentioned, is I'm at Queen's University Belfast, where I teach and research in historical geography. But I'm also privileged to also be the chair of the Historic Towns Trust, which is the organisation which really oversees the production of the British Historic Towns Atlases. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, and to give you some insights really in terms of, I appreciate a number of you will be familiar with the kind of work we do, because some of you will be familiar, for example, with Giles Darks, who is, I know, a BCS member, and his contribution to cartography. And Giles is our cartographic editor for the British Historic Towns Atlases. So I'm going to give you a sort of a retrospective, a looking backwards, a little look at where we are now, and also a slight, hopefully, a positive look to the future as well, of where we might go in the future. Without being too gratuitous, I have a long interest in maps, map making, and map makers. So some pictures there of some letters I wrote as a I think probably 10-year-old, 1978, yes, to the Ordnance Survey at Southampton. At that particular time, wanting to know a little bit more about benchmarks and trig pillars. And I was very kindly sent some fantastic materials, as you can see there. And I still have those letters. They mean a lot to me. So from those times. And then into where in my professional life, I'm very fortunate to work at Queen's University Belfast in a geography department, able to go out into the field normally when we're not subject to pandemic restrictions, and to indulge myself in many ways, working on in this particular picture on the right-hand side, on what I'm calling the archaeology of cartography, looking at surveyors in the field and the material culture left behind by the Ordnance Survey in that particular case. So, this is something very, very close to my heart, the world of maps and map making. Just to sort of put you in the picture. But my real focus, of course, is to say a little bit about the British Historic Towns Atlas. And so I've got a few slides here to illustrate what the British Historic Towns Atlas is, and also to raise some issues which I hope will be of interest about how we create our atlases and what we might be able to achieve through using them in different sorts of ways. So just to start us off, really, the British Historic Towns Atlas is a series of atlases, really, which has its origins back in the 1960s, mid-1960s. I'm going to show some examples in a minute. But it was seen, and it still is, part of a broader international project. There's a whole series of national historic towns atlases from across Europe, a pan-European project. And the idea was, after the Second World War, to try and encourage comparative research across the European nation states, which had been so badly ravaged through the Second World War, and to use atlases and maps especially to encourage that comparative process, to compare historic towns and cities, and to really understand our shared heritage, I suppose we might call it now. And the principles behind those atlases, there was really important and stated at the time that the atlases had to enable us to undertake comparative research on historic towns and cities. So consistent scale and content were really important principles, and they still are for the atlases, which I'll show you in a minute, to enable us to compare our towns and cities. So the overall program, really, for Britain is overseen by the Historic Towns Trust, but for Europe as a whole, there's the International Commission for the History of Towns, which is a sort of international consortium, which has a kind of coordinating role, I suppose. Just so looking back in time, our first 3 Atlas volumes look like this. They're available actually as PDFs to download from our website. You'll see the URL a little bit later on. Volume 1 on the left-hand side from 1969, for Volume 2, 1975, and then Volume 3, London, up to 1520, 1989. The first 2 volumes actually were multi-fascicle, we call them fascicles, but they contained, the first 2 volumes contained a number of different towns and cities. But the later volumes, London, and the 3 more recent volumes you see here, just focus on, well, for Winchester, York, and London, one particular place, but for Windsor and Eton, we actually combined those 2 towns together in one volume because they have such close topographies and histories. And it's really topography and history that we're trying to explore through our atlases. That's the primary focus. The European program is quite geographically uneven in, as you can see here, the number of places and countries so far covered by the Atlas program. I believe there are about 500 atlases, so that doesn't look like it from that map, but I believe there are 500 atlases for Europe. But as you can see, there are some gaps on the map, particularly the Iberian Peninsula and some of the Scandinavian countries there. And also some quite prolific output from certain countries, particularly Ireland, looked after by the Royal Irish Academy project there, and other parts of Central Europe as well, East Central Europe. The scheme that was set out for the maps for the atlases was agreed really during the course of the 1960s. And one of the kind of key common denominators really was to ensure each atlas had a map of scale 1 to 2500. And the idea was to have such a map which was not only of a standard scale, but was also of a standardized period, that it focused on the early 19th century, as it says there, really focusing at that particular time, 1960s, on encouraging comparisons before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Although more recently, this now has been looked at again really by the ICHT, recognizing the huge amount of interest there is in towns and cities for the 19th and 20th centuries. But those are the kind of sort of standards, if you like, for the historic towns atlases, more or less adopted across Europe as a whole. And here's just a selection of those atlases. I put our our first volume, historic towns there. And just to give you, I don't know if you can still see me here, but just to give you an idea of these volumes, they're quite hefty things, really. One of the advantages of using these sorts of modern technologies is that I don't have to lug these things around from place to place. So this is Viborg here. So from Finland, and then we have from Hungary. This is the Buda volume. The Irish Historic Towns Atlas goes from strength to strength. Here's Tune. And what else have we got here? Recent Czech atlas, Zlin. And I think there's one more. Yes, the Ukrainian atlas here, which is one of the more recent ones, is 2018. So those are the covers there for you to see. But the contents are broadly standardized across the atlases. But I'm obviously going to focus on the British Historic Towns Atlas and say a little bit about that. And the past part of my talk looks back to the origins of the British Historic Towns Atlas in the early 1960s. And there were really two key figures here which have a shared, a common connection, and that connection is the city of Oxford. And this is Colonel Henry Johns, a caricature of Henry Johns from his wartime days. And I know you'll see there, Lovell Johns Limited, a strong connection between the Historic Towns Trust today still and our atlases, and Lovell Johns, the company that Henry Johns founded back in the 1960s, really as a result of these interests and collaboration with Roddy LaBelle, who's pictured here in her later years, who was a really, really key and influential individual like Johns in setting up the British Historic Towns Atlases. And Roddy LaBelle's background, really academic background especially, was a close involvement with the Victoria County History series and with Oxford, the volumes for Oxford. And between the two of them, really, you could say that they pretty much engineered during the 1960s the program that became the British Historic Towns Atlases. This map on the right-hand side actually features in volume 1, and the number of dots, I know you won't be able to see them very clearly there, but the number of dots represent the historic towns and cities of Great Britain. And at that time also Ireland, although Ireland is covered by the Irish Historic Towns Atlas series, which began in the 1980s, which is so separate now. But for Great Britain, a whole series of dots on that map representing places, but the aspirations perhaps at that time. And then on the left-hand side, those places, those towns and cities, which have been so far covered by the atlases. And we have much, much more work to do, as you can imagine, as you can see, and also the names there of those associated with those particular atlases. Another way to think about the range of atlases that have been created, not just think about them geographically or indeed chronologically, but to think about them typologically. And this is me wearing my urban morphology hat on, I suppose, and thinking about how we might use these standardized atlases, combining text and maps, to begin to compare towns and cities of the same kind of type. So, we might begin to group together some of those atlases around particular headings, Anglo-Saxon burghs, so defended towns from the late 11th century, or from the, mid 10th to the 11th century. Cities with Roman origins, or castle towns, market centres, monastic towns, so on. So, as we approach these atlases historically, we might begin to think about how we compare one place with another place, which has a common trajectory. but also we might want to compare different places across different time periods. And of course, we can do that. So this is an example from volume 1, it is so far our only Welsh town, it has to be said. And also volume 1 included so far our only Scottish city, which is Glasgow. And we're hoping to extend that coverage somewhat. But this is Carnarvon, and you can see there the distinctive cartography of volume 1 and also volume 2 as well. And the conventions and symbology were standardized across all the maps, as they still are, and we still stick pretty much closely to that symbology, the representation of different types of land use, for example. I can just zoom in here. Buildings and streets picked out, medieval buildings differentiated from post-medieval buildings, extant medieval buildings differentiated from those which have disappeared. Defensive features you can see there for Carnarvon, the town ditch, for example. So these are actually multi-period maps. They compress within one map image a whole series of urban features from different historic periods. So they are multi-period maps. And in fact, I like to sort of see them as a series of layers that have all been compressed into one map image, but nevertheless can be sort of read across in a kind of chronological sense across time as well as space. The compilation process, as it was undertaken by Colonel Johns, was very much, this is for London in the 1980s, the London volume, very much kind of key element of the atlas making process, not only drafting the text, of course, but working between the authors of the volume, the text, the interpretive text, and the maps. So the maps and the text work hand in hand. The maps aren't simply there as pictures by any means. The maps are intended to be fully integrated with the text so that it becomes possible to use the maps as a way of understanding the topographical history of a particular place, which complements the text, and to read the text in a way that complements our interpretation of the map. And that compilation process here is captured very nicely. And our archive actually is at the Bodleian Library, looked after by Nick Milley, one of our trustees. So this is an example of the kind of work done in the compilation of the map for London 1520. We are now, I should say, fully digital under that in the capable hands of Giles Dark, so I mentioned earlier. But just to think about what we might begin to do comparing, I mentioned comparing, the idea of these atlases to compare places. So just from volume 1 here, we have Nottingham, so an Anglo-Saxon burh, which is identifiable in the morphology, in the shape of the streets to the east, a part of the town, as you see it there, with the Norman castle town planted on the west side. You can see the castle very clearly there, I hope. Compare that with Hereford, very similar kind of model of urban development in many ways, with an earlier pre-Norman burh, a defended town, with a castle from the Norman period inserted into it, and a Norman suburban development, which is the large marketplace you can see there to the north of the defended town, later infilled. And then here's Bristol from volume 2 from 1975. But again, another Anglo-Saxon burh, right in the centre there. We see the burh defences and the curvilinear outline of those defences, and also a Norman castle town planted on the side, on the eastern side of that burh. So, we can begin to compare these maps of certain towns. So they're multi-period maps, as I've mentioned, but if we focus in on one particular time period, in this case, the late 11th, early 12th centuries, we can begin to make comparisons across these important towns and cities of late Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England, and undertake our diachronic and synchronic analyses to look at towns and cities at particular points in time. That's the synchronic analysis, as well as over time, the diachronic analysis. So really, that's what we've been trying to encourage through our atlases, not just in Britain, but across the whole European programme. And in a sense, that's a little bit about looking backwards. I also want to look at where we are now and also look forwards a little bit too in the next 10 minutes or thereabouts. So this is our map of the atlases, and I'm going to focus on Coventry, partly because I know a little bit about Coventry. I did my PhD thesis on medieval Coventry when I was at the University of Birmingham a number of years ago now. But it's also a city that is, as I'm sure you're aware, this year's the UK City of Culture. And we've been partnering with organisations in Coventry to create a new map of Coventry based upon our Historic Towns Atlas of Coventry, which was first published in 1975. As you can see there, it was actually published as a separate fascicle in 1975, and the cover of our new historical map of Coventry, which is about to be, I think Giles sent it to the printers on Monday this week, so it's soon to be appearing in a good bookshop near you, I'm sure. So I think Coventry provides us with a possibility here, provides me with a possibility to sort of link past and present, but also future, the digital, because in the Historic Towns Atlases, we see digital and analog or print as complementary. They're complementary in the sense that, you know, people will still want to buy our paper maps. You know, people still want a paper map, do they not? I certainly do. I know many people do. But equally, the internet and also digital mapping provides us with an opportunity to reach wider audiences. So this is just compiled from the new Coventry Atlas created for the Coventry UK City of Culture, which contains our new town and city historical map of Coventry as one of the layers within that GIS. But I'm running ahead of myself. So this is the Coventry map, which was in that volume in 1975. So as you can see there, it is based upon, you'll be familiar now already, I'm sure, with our symbology. Similar in its appearance as a map to our other maps you saw earlier, for example, of Nottingham and Carnarvon. The challenge with Coventry, of course, for those working on Coventry in the 1960s, is Joan Lancaster, who was the lead author for the Coventry Atlas, was, of course, the conditions of the city itself, having itself been badly bombed in the Second World War, as we know, and at that particular point being comprehensively redeveloped under the plans of Donald Gibson and his successors in Coventry. And we see this 1963 aerial photograph of Coventry, which kind of indicates, I think, that kind of turmoil of the city. And you can imagine at the time how this view of Coventry might have looked a little bit more restful. The view, I should say, you've just been looking at is from the west, looking towards the east. So I'm not sure how well I can point on this. No, it's not going to work. But the view here on the aerial photograph, just to show you again, is from the west to the east. You can just about see there in the distance the St. Michael's Church, which was the what we call now the old cathedral in Coventry, and the precinct area being developed in the middle part of the photograph there. The Coventry map, like our other British Historic Towns Atlas maps, is an example of an historical map. So in the sense that it's an interpretative map, but it's based upon an historic map source. In the case for Coventry, that historic map source that was chosen was, as you can see here, Samuel Bradford's plan of Coventry of the mid-18th century. And I put these two images side by side just so you can get some sense of how the historic map, the Bradford map, is used as a base on which other cartographic, historical, archaeological, topographical information is then added to create our historical map. We call it a principal or summary map on the left-hand side, which is the map at that 1 to 2,500 scale with our standardized symbology. We tend now more to use, in the Historic Towns Atlases, we tend to now to more use the Ordnance Survey, larger scale Ordnance Survey plans, historic Ordnance Survey plans from the late 19th, early 20th centuries as our base maps rather than these sort of private surveys. And that's partly because the Ordnance Survey provides us with a kind of consistency in terms of scale and so forth, which is useful for compilation. But the point to make again with our map on the left-hand side, our historical map, is that it is a multi-period map and it compresses on one map image features from the urban landscape from different time periods. So one of the features which for Coventry is very mysterious and actually is quite challenging for us to map is the castle. And some of you, many of you I know, think, well, Nottingham, we know there's a castle at Nottingham. You probably know Hereford has had a castle, and Bristol as well. The castle is still extant actually at Bristol as it is in Nottingham, and indeed Carnarvon. But Coventry, did Coventry have a castle? Well, yes, it did. But its location has perplexed archaeologists, historians, geographers, and indeed the Historic Towns Atlas for decades. So, and one of the reasons it's perplexed us all is because although it's documented in the 12th century and in written records, it soon disappeared from the urban landscape as a castle, but nevertheless sort of left its imprint in the street pattern. And the challenge has been trying to identify and piece together the remains of the castle from archaeology, from documentary sources, and from the topography of the town itself, and trying to really hazard a guess. And I'm sure as cartographers and map makers, you're well used to this difficulty of mapping uncertainty. Even by the time of Speed's map of Coventry, 1610, the castle had long gone as a physical upstanding feature in the urban landscape of Coventry. I quite like to show this slide. This is from the lower precinct in Coventry, those of you familiar with Coventry. And I used to walk past this going down to the Round Cafe, the Wimpy, with my mom in the late 70s. And we used to pass by this as we walked down the ramp, we used to pass by this Speed map. So anyway, enough of that. This is the tiles themselves were designed by Gordon Cullen, whose work I guess you'll know as well from his work on townscapes. So Joan Lancaster was also involved with the Victoria County history, and this is the map from the VCH for Coventry. And it's fairly typical, actually, of the kinds of maps, I'm afraid to say, produced by historians. And they tend to be quite skeletal. They tend to really just show streets, key buildings, and defences, as you can see here. And what they miss really are the plot patterns, the buildings, the fabric of an urban landscape. So it looks quite an empty looking urban landscape, really. But she has actually identified, you can see in the middle there, I can't point to it, the outlines, it says there, suggested site of 12th century castle. So, and it's that castle that we see here on the VCH map, which really becomes used then in the British Historic Towns Atlas map of 1975 for Coventry, which you saw earlier. In the 1970s, after the publication of the Atlas, of course, there have been new insights into the location of the castle. Archaeological excavations, for example, as represented here. These are some maps from my PhD thesis, but you can see there from loads of different sources by archaeologists like Margaret Rylett, all trying to pin down the location of the castle. And Peter Koss, in his book Early Records Made of Coventry, using property deeds, you can see in the middle there, it says castle area, began to pin down through documentary sources the more precise locations of where perhaps the castle was. And in my PhD thesis, this is one of my own maps, I was interested, you can see how different this is to the map of Coventry from the VCH. If you add in plot boundaries, the landscape of Coventry fleshes out much more. Instead of just getting that skeleton of streets, we've now got flesh on the bones, so to speak, and we begin to see the shape, the layout, the form of Coventry. This is medieval Coventry, as represented on my map here, which in itself, that form, the shape, is instructive. That map itself is based upon the Board of Health plans for Coventry, which are these amazing, these are now available also on the Coventry Atlas online, amazing pieces of map work, of cartography, hugely detailed. So these are the maps and plans I used for that previous map I showed you, and begin to analyze the morphology, the shape of Coventry, medieval Coventry, and those different so-called plan units represent the different phases of development. And number one there is our castle area. And my supposition in my thesis actually was to, and we're going to get back to Coventry in the Atlas in a minute, but just to say, was to piece together the archaeological excavations, documentary sources, and the morphology, and try and postulate the outlines of the castle as it was before it was destroyed in the late 12th century. So all of this then has been going on, and Ian Soden, the city archaeologist in Coventry in the 1980s, came up with another possibility as mapped in his book here, Coventry, the Hidden History, and the castle in the middle there. He postulates a Motte and Bailey type, which I've never seen any evidence actually for a motte, a mound. But the motte idea also is seen in George Numidovich's map or representation of late 12th century Coventry is seen here. So all of us trying to grapple with this problem, and this is to bring us back to Coventry in the modern day, this is our new town and city historical map of Coventry in this series, which I showed you earlier. This has been work done by Mark Webb and a team in Coventry, by Giles Darks for the Historic Towns Trust, and also input from me as well because of my interest in Coventry. But one of the challenges then is identifying the castle, knowing of course that Lancaster's map from 1975 needed some reworking because of the new archaeological work. The other thing to point out on this new version, of course, is that we're not using Bradford's 1750 plan as a base. We're using the Ordnance Survey 25-inch 1913 edition as our base. So we get a very different view of Coventry actually, as it were, in 1750, using a base of 1750 as opposed to using a base of 1913. We might want to come back to that point later. But this is how we began to think about mapping the castle, the uncertainty of the castle. Initially a sort of cartographic fudge to some extent of just having a stippled area and site of Coventry Castle, just to sort of recognize these different interpretations. But actually on the reverse of the map, because as well as the map on these folding maps, as we call them, there's also a gazetteer on the reverse with all the different features. But we've also had this little inset map here, which combines the different interpretations of the castle site, mine, George Numidovich's, and the original one from the British Historic Towns Atlas from 1975. And of course, we all recognize, we well know that maps are not value-free images, that they are a product of lots of different hands, if you like. They silence as well as give voice. And this little inset map is really just our way of saying, giving some transparency to that map making process, to say there are these different kinds of interpretations. We can also then use our map layers as well to help people to navigate Coventry, as we're trying to do, and to think about the complexity of city's development. So our map layer now for Coventry, for this Coventry Atlas, is one of many. So it sits next to the historic maps, like the Board of Health Plan, for example. I'm nearly finished now. So just to look forward then, 2021, we see a whole raft of these maps coming out. So we've got map for Bristol, 1480, which is this one here. Canterbury is imminent, Alnwick and Ulmouth and Coventry, all pretty much being drawn and produced to the same standards. Bristol 1480 is slightly different because we actually have for Bristol 1480 an attempt there to map the city as it was in 1480, whereas the other maps are multi-period in the way I just showed you. And then there's the Oxford Atlas. So to continue our Atlas program, our next volume is for Oxford, which Alan Crossley has edited, another person with a strong Victoria County history connection. And just in case you'd like to know more about all of our activities, we do have our own lecture program, and it's there on the right-hand side. So our next talk actually is Giles Darks, who's getting lots of name checks, and Helen Fulton, who's another trustee who works at the University of Bristol, and they will be talking about this very map, making Bristol medieval. And then Sarah Rees-Jones talking about York and the North East, and she's another trustee of us. So I think that's probably enough for me. I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'll be very interested, if you're still with me, to hear any questions or comments that you may have. I'm just going to try and find myself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Keith, for that. That's been a very interesting talk, and now we'll move on to the questions. So our first question we have is: Are there particular regions of Great Britain or towns and cities that the Historic Towns Trust has had an eye on for developing new Atlas projects in the near future?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That's a great question. The answer to that is yes. If I could have shown you a greater, more detailed view of that map from 1969, one of the countries actually now, as we are the nations within the nation, where we really do need to address is Scotland, and as well as that Wales. So really, we are looking north of the border and also across the Welsh March as well. Helen Fulton, our trustee, has been talking to colleagues at Swansea. I really think Swansea would be a terrific city to have an atlas for Wales. And for Scotland as well, we have John Moore, who I'm sure many of you will know, as a trustee, and he's also doing sterling work for us up north of the border to try and identify potential atlas cities or towns there. In England itself, yes, Canterbury, I think, would be a really great. We've just had our map published for Canterbury. I think that would be a really great city to work to. But also, it's not just medieval towns and cities. I think there has been a tendency over the last 50 years, and the first volume was published in 1969, to focus on those sorts of historic towns and cities with medieval or Roman origins. I think looking more to the more recent historical periods would be a good thing, actually, to move into the 18th and 19th centuries more.
Okay, right. So another interesting question. It's how is the program funded?
Well, yes, this is a really good point, actually. And I gave a talk this last week, and I neglected to make this point because I think it's an important one to make. And it's about funding, because the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, which is immensely successful and has been hugely prolific, is properly resourced through the Royal Irish Academy. Whereas the British Historic Towns Atlas, this is my plea for money now, is a charitable setup. The Historic Towns Trust is a charitable organisation. So we actually have an endowment which provides us with a certain amount of income, but really that's really to sort of secure a certain amount of running costs. But we really need much more funding. That each individual atlas has to be, or map indeed, has to be self-funding and self-financing, which means fundraising. So we have a fundraising group which is always busy and active trying to raise funds for these projects across the country. So we are slightly different, and each country across the European whole series of these European atlases will be funded in slightly different ways. But we are a charity, so we do seek funding sometimes from grants. Sometimes our project partners will apply for grants and be successful. The Mark Fitch Fund has been very generous in its funding, for example, of the map of Hull. And sometimes private benefactors as well for the Oxford Atlas have been very generous in providing funds for the new Oxford Atlas. So it's really a range of different funds, but we have to be very proactive all the time with this fundraising program to support us.
Okay, yes. So quite a complex picture there we can see. Okay, right. So one more question here. With my education committee hat on, have you thought about maps for younger minds?
Yes, brilliant. Yes, absolutely. And this is one thing we are really, really keen to see happen, especially now we are developing our folding maps, as we call them, these things which are pretty affordable. They're £10 to buy in the shops, folks. So they're pretty affordable. But also our sort of digital outreach as well means that we can begin to perhaps get broader access, broader use of the maps and the atlases as well. And we've been trying to develop some discussion. It's in early stages so far with the Historical Association, for example. I think in Coventry's UK City of Culture, with lots of interest there in schools in Coventry, in heritage and the city's past, there's a good opportunity perhaps to see the new Coventry map being used there more proactively. But I get it's really, if we could begin to build into the curricula, for example, or see particular alignments between the curriculum used in schools and our atlases and our maps, I think that will strengthen the usage. I really want to see young people using our maps, not only because they're fantastic things, but I think the maps themselves open up insights into localities, into locations. You can imagine maybe a school teacher in Coventry spreading out the map of Coventry, getting the children to look at it, think about, well, where do they live? What did Coventry look like 100 years ago? Because the map base is 1913, it's around 100 years ago. And also, how has Coventry changed and what things have not changed? It opens up all sorts of interesting aspects of getting the children to think about urban change, urban landscapes, about heritage, and importantly for all of us, I'm sure, about using maps and being mindful of maps and the possibilities that maps provide for us. So yes, I'm glad you've said that. I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more and talk a little bit more with you at BCS actually, because if the things that we can do together collaboratively, I'm all for that. I think that's really the way to go. So things we can work on together and promoting map use in schools and colleges, that would be terrific.
Okay, so we have okay, thank you very much for the answer there. So there's a range of historic base maps used for the historic town atlases, principal maps of different periods. Is there a preference for one era in particular, or does that depend on the place being mapped?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I sort of mentioned in relation to Coventry back in 75 or in the early 70s. The decision must have been made to use Bradford's map of plan of 1750, which really is in some ways quite schematic in its, especially in its representation of plot boundaries, and it is the kind of the flesh, if you like, which I mentioned about in relation to the street skeleton of Coventry. So the problem with using some of those pre-19th century plans like Bradford's, of course, is one of consistency. If you're looking at different town cities, you really want to have maps of a consistent base. So we're now looking more to the Ordnance Survey, 25-inch or larger scales actually than the 25 inches of base. But we're recognized, relating to this question here about different periods, sometimes it may be, as in the case of Coventry, that there's a particular revision, in our case 1913 for Coventry, which we thought was probably going to speak to the audience more than if we'd chosen an earlier edition or indeed a later edition. So, this is why there is some flexibility, I think. In the case of Hull, we chose a slightly later post First World War, I think it's 1927, because there were some interesting changes in Hull, which we could show on that base map for the early 20th century, which had we gone for a 19th century map, then they wouldn't obviously have been visible. So I think broadly speaking, the preference really is for late 19th century, early 20th century. But there is now this recognition in the International Commission on the History of Towns that our atlases and maps perhaps ought to bring the story up to date, so to speak. So there's a real challenge there, because if we use let's say for sake of argument, the 1960s or 70s map, let's say for Coventry, if we'd chosen a 1970 base map for Coventry, then many of the historic features which were destroyed in the war would have obviously not been there to see. So with any kind of map, it's always a matter of compromise, really. And we want to use the map as a stepping stone to relate the modern day urban landscape back to some time in the past. So 100 years ago, there's still enough in an urban landscape from 100 years ago for people to orientate themselves. Before then, you jump back even further into the past, let's say to the medieval period, where features may have disappeared, like the castle of Coventry in the 12th century. And I think the danger of using a map, let's say like Bradford of 1750, is that there's not enough on that map to give people that ability to orientate themselves to the modern urban landscape. So, it's a complex problem there, really. But our preference at the moment is for this sort of late 19th, early 20th century 25-inch scale mapping of the Ordnance Survey as our base.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. That's been our
Thanks.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank Keith once again for an interesting talk, and I hope that you will join us for future talks. Our next talk will be from Mary Spence with her talk on From Pen to Pixel, the changing face of map production. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.